Well, this is not going to be a ranting, raving video tonight. It's rather a contemplative kind of thing, and it deals in large part also with human psychology as a whole. And the one thing I'm wondering about is why so many Democrats and especially progressives are still giving Obama the benefit of the doubt when it becomes quite obvious to quite a few people that he is basically selling us out on virtually every level. Now, this is a very serious issue because I don't hate the man. It has nothing to do with hate. It has nothing to do with him, being the first black president. It has nothing to do with him exaggerating his campaign promises or whatever. We're all kind of used to that. Nobody can fulfill every promise. But I think the whole thing goes much deeper than that. And it's much more profound. So in this context, I was reading some stuff, and in this context I want to bring up this experiment. It's a psychological experiment, controversial, which took place in 1961, and it's called the Milgram experiment. So this was essentially a psychological experiment to see how people would respond to what they perceived as credible authority figures. And most certainly, the president, or let's say anybody that you find credible, is such a figure, at least for most people. So what I want to say here is it's not just about this president. It's about something deeper. So let me delve right into it, and I'm going to read you some excerpts from some exchanges that took place between several bloggers, and it's worth noting, I think. And it might actually be a two-part video if this one gets too long. It's, like I say, I'm not going to be ranting, raving mad about it. The whole problem, I think, goes much deeper for all of us, really. So one poster started off as saying this: I can't just put off toleration of murder and torture as not paying attention. And he's referring to people who still support Obama here. Okay? I know what you mean about drama and rooting for the team, but I attribute these activities to identification with power. I understand that people are very complex, but I can't say there's nothing wrong with being willing to support someone who murders and tortures. This is in the Obama context now. This is not within the Bush-Cheney realm, although of course that was also the case back then. It's just wrong. I can't keep making excuses for doing that. And so the responder goes, this is a difficult one for sure. Do you remember the Milgram series of experiments on obedience to authority? And, some of my viewers might be completely out of the loop here. They don't know what the Milgram experiments were. Well, there's plenty of it on YouTube. You can look it up, okay? You can Google it, the whole thing. So I'm not going to be posting the Milgram experiments on my channel if you don't have the inclination to actually look it up on your own. But basically, what it boils down to, or what it boiled down to, was this. Experienced psychologists and psychiatrists were surveyed before he started this experiment. They uniformly predicted that only the obligative psychopathic 1 or 2% would continue the shocks being administered into the danger zone. Everyone else, they predicted, would be so revulsed that they would refuse to continue long before they reached that point. But those experiments proved that those experienced professionals were not just a little wrong, but totally wrong. 2/3 of all participants in this experiment continued to the very end of this experiment, which meant administering shocks, electric shocks to people, which, as far as they knew, could kill somebody. Many of them, the subjects of this experiment, were anguished, but their will was completely enthralled to the will of the experimenter. Only a few seemed not to feel any conflict, and there were lots of people who had conflicts. But essentially what it boiled down to, that 60% of the participants in this experiment went through it all the way to the end. Milton Mayer's book, They Thought They Were Free, described similar attitudes on the part of ordinary Germans who had survived Nazism and the war. His respondents saw themselves as kleine Leute, little people, and accepted no responsibility for what the Nazis did. As far as they were concerned, the große Leute, the bigwigs up top, took all the decisions, and the little people down below had no options but to go along. And they had the reality on their side. Those who refused to go along were sometimes punished severely. Now, more recently, a former middle school teacher wrote an influential book called The Teenage Liberation Handbook for kids who are being strangled by industrialized education. The opening sentence of chapter 1 is, "How strange and self-defeating that a supposedly free country should train its young for a life of totalitarianism." And she goes on to note, the most overwhelming reality of school is control. School controls the way you spend your time, how you behave, what you read, and to a large extent what you think. In school, you can't control your own life, obviously. And if you look at the history of freedom, You notice that the most frightening thing about people who are not free is that they learn to take their bondage for granted and to believe that this bondage is normal and natural. They may not like it, but few question it or imagine anything different could exist. The people who infringe most dangerously and inescapably on your freedom are those who say they are helping you, those who are convinced, basically they're trying to convince you that you need their help. And what all of this tells me, I'm just reading comments here, okay? And what all of this tells me is that responsibility is an attitude of mind or an ascription, but not a thing in the world. Responsibility and power should always be in balance, but too often it isn't. We're trained from cradle to feel no sense of personal power or responsibility except when carrying out orders. The disconnect between our training and our natural feelings. Think of the 2-year-old's tearful, red-faced, bellowed demands causes tension, which we partly solve by identifying with figures of power and cheering them on. So, I agree with you that people can't be given a pass on their support for the Bushes, Obamas at all. At all. My accent is funny, I'm sorry. It's a legal term. But I also can't bring myself to treat them as though they had chosen their situation. The only people who choose evil are psychopaths. The rest of us believe, con ourselves maybe, that at worst we're not trying to harm others. As to how to reach them, I can't recall whether you've ever mentioned your age, so I'll have to ask. Again, I have to mention here, this is a conversation between two people which I'm quoting here. Very interesting, by the way. So I have to ask, were you involved in the second wave 40 years ago? And if you were, do you remember consciousness-raising tasks or that click that was supposed to happen? And, you know, then the poster goes on and on about this. The response was, well, thank you for taking the time to post your thoughtful response. I really appreciate it. It's interesting that you brought out the Milgram experiments. In February of 2009, I kept writing and talking about those, saying Obama is basically the left's Milgram experiment. Personally, you know, I don't think so at all. I think Obama is fully on board with the corporate agenda. But this is just what this poster is saying. But we're talking about psychology here, okay? So, Obama supposedly is the left's Milgram experiment. And this is exactly how I thought about the situation at the time. It is worth noting that on follow-up, many people in those experiments said that it was one of the most profound things that ever happened to them. They realized that they were, as ordinary people, capable of the most horrific things imaginable. When interviewed years later, most of these people found themselves able to resist unjust authority and manipulation. And as I see it, current Obama supporters learned nothing from their own Milgram experiment. They refuse to recognize when they are being manipulated. And they absolutely will not stand up to any unjust authority, even when there is no personal cost to them themselves. Every adult person has likely done at least one thing that they truly regret doing. A compassionate person recognizes that what they did was wrong and tries to make it right. I don't see that self-knowledge, compassion, or willingness to make things right in current Obama supporters. I see people who are scared and scary. I see people ready to take their orders, obey, and have no limits on what they are willing to do for their so-called leader. You know, me personally, I feel the same thing about the Tea Party supporters. They also have no qualms about following their leaders. So essentially what we're talking about here is the very same thing. This obedience, this acquiescence to authority, simply because we're trained to do that from the very start. So I guess that's kind of the point I wanted to bring up with this experiment. And you should really watch those experiments because, and you know, if you're not inclined to do so, too lazy to even look it up, you know, you probably shouldn't even be watching my channel. Because this is really, really important human insight. And yeah, there's a lot of shit that human beings, including myself and many others, are capable of doing, and we don't even know it. And until we're pushed into a certain situation, or until we just accept the status quo and go along with it. You know, I pretty much agree with Hannah Arendt's conclusion of the banality of evil. It's not that, you know, people want to be evil. They believe in what they want to believe in. And oftentimes they don't see the implications of their actions ahead of time, you know. So, yeah, I guess it's just one of those videos where I can't really draw a concrete conclusion here. But I do want to point out that it is not a good thing to tolerate intolerance. At some point, you have to start fighting back against this. And, you know, tolerance of intolerance, blatantly intolerant views can only go so far in a just and democratic society. And what I'm seeing developing here in the United States and elsewhere is the rise of intolerance, intolerance of different opinions, not to, you know, a apocalyptic level, I would like to add, but it is a dangerous, dangerous trend. And I'm not willing to go along with that. And, you know, so I'm just going to keep speaking out. And if people want to hate me for that, that's their deal, you know. So it's time to really reflect on our own vulnerabilities, you know, in terms of psychology, what we're actually capable of as humans in terms of violence and in terms of fostering violence. While we ourselves might not be able to or willing to do it, but there is that element within us that might spur others on to do that kind of shit. And it's not a good thing, because it's an unending cycle, you know. Because an eye for an eye makes everybody blind, because it just fucking continues. Yeah, well, that's my philosophical treatise for tonight. See you all later.